In this video, you're going to learn how to set up forms inside of your JavaScript applications. This is going to allow us to combine inputs and buttons together to create a form that the user can submit. So this is a bit different than what we have so far. Right now, we do have inputs, but we don't wait for the user to submit. We just filter on every single keystroke. So as I type, we filter the things. But if I was trying to add a new note by its title or a new to-do by its text, this really wouldn't make much sense. I want to wait for the user to finish typing everything. Then I want some sort of separate button where they can click something like add note or save to do. In order to get that done, we're going to use a form. So over in the browser, let's start kicking this one off by removing the Remove All Notes button. That button was originally added for example purposes, but it's not going to make its way into the final version of the application. I'm also going to delete the event handler for the Remove All button, or click handler, over in the notes.js file. So I'm going to delete it here and here, saving both. Now, step one to creating our form is to actually work with a new tag. So right here, we're going to create a form element. A form element is not an empty element, which means we do want to open and close our tags. And what we put inside is the combination of form fields as well as buttons. So in our case, we'll have a simpler form to start with a single input and a button that allows you to submit the form. The input that we put inside of here is going to look very similar to any of the other inputs we've created in this course. I'm going to set up the input, which is an empty element, so no closing tag necessary. And I'm going to set up my type equals text, and I'll set up a placeholder. Obviously, the placeholder and type are completely optional. And for this one, I'll use something like first name. And the other thing that we're going to provide for input that we haven't used before is the name attribute. The name attribute is something that you put on your fields when they're inside of a form. This makes it really easy to access all of those field values when the form actually gets submitted. So we'll explore what happens when a form gets submitted in a second. For the moment, let's just set up an appropriate name for this. Now, the name attribute is one of the situations where we are going to stick to camel casing because the name that we put inside of here is actually something we'll end up typing over in JavaScript to access the field's value. Right here, I'm going to go ahead and use first name. Excellent. So that's it for the input. We'll talk about the implications of setting up that name in a second when we get to the JavaScript side of things. The next thing we're going to do is set up a button like any old button we've created before. No attributes necessary, and we can pick whatever text we like for the submit button. I will appropriately name it submit. So we have a form. We have an input, we have a button. Let's actually save this markup and see what happens when the browser refreshes. Over here, we got our form. I have my input, I could type my name in, and I have a submit button showing up. Now, clearly the form field isn't visually doing anything on the page. We have an input that looks just like the input above and a button that looks just like the button right here. But since we do have a form, we can now submit it. When we submit a form by clicking the forms button, we can see what the default behavior is. And this is something that we're actually going to override. So I'm going to click that button with some data typed in. And what happens? Well, what happened is that the browser actually went through a full page refresh. This is why our data is now gone. And if we check out the URL, we can see the URL has also changed. We now have the form data living up here in the URL. This is the default behavior for a form, and it goes back way to the early web. This existed before client-side JavaScript was something that we could realistically depend on. Back in the day, a lot of browsers didn't have good JavaScript support or just didn't have JavaScript support at all, so this was necessary. This was our way of getting data back to whatever server we were using. These days, though, we have great JavaScript support, and in almost all situations, we want to handle that form submission via client-side JavaScript code. That's going to allow us to validate the data on the fly and do things like render an error message without completely wiping all of the user's information. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can get that done. The first thing we're going to do is add an ID onto the form. So no matter how many inputs we have in our form, there's no need to target any of those individually. We just need to target the form from our JavaScript. So right here, ID, I can call this one name form or whatever makes sense for your form. I'm going to save this, and now we're going to target it by its ID and add an event listener on. Over here at the bottom of the file, document.query selector. I'm going to select the element whose ID is name form, and we're going to add an event listener. Dot add event listener. This is going to allow us to provide the event name, and for forms, the only event that we're ever going to be using is the submit event. The submit event is fired when the user takes an action to submit a form. That could be clicking the button or hitting enter in one of the inputs. So for example, over here, I could type in some characters, hit the enter key, and that submits the form. We now have the new data showing up. So the submit event is what we're listening for. We're then going to set up our function and our event argument. And what we want to do inside of here is first cancel the default behavior of the form. We want to tell the browser not to go through that full page refresh and not to add anything up above in the URL. We're going to handle it on our own with the code in this function. To do that, we use a method on E, one of the only methods we're ever going to be using on E. It is e.prevent default. This is going to prevent the default behavior. In this case, the default behavior of the event is to go through that process of refreshing the page with an updated URL. Now it's going to allow us to handle the form submission. So if we were to save this file, we're going to see very different behavior over in the browser. To make sure that we don't already have some data in the URL, let's wipe that and bring us back to our base URL. I'm then going to type something in, like my name. I'm going to hit submit. And what happens? Well, absolutely nothing. We canceled all that default behavior, and now the browser is simply waiting for us to do something meaningful down below. For the moment, let's just go ahead and get access to the form data and print it to the console. First up, we are going to be accessing e.target. This is what gets us to the DOM element for the form. Now on here, what we're looking for is a special property on our form DOM elements, and it's called elements. Elements. Elements is going to allow us to access all of the fields we've set up. In this case, we've set up a single field, we have our input, and we're going to be accessing it by its name. So first name. In here, we can go ahead and grab that dot first name. And this is a representation of the DOM element for the input. So how do we get a value off of an input? We use the value prop, just like we did up above. So dot value. That's going to allow us to get the form field value, and all we're going to do is wrap it in parentheses and toss console.log up front. Console.log, and this will have the end result of printing the value that we type in to the console. Over here, I have Andrew. I'm going to switch that up to something else. I'll use Jen. I hit submit. And what happens? I get Jen printing over here. So this is how we are going to submit data where it doesn't make sense to do things on the fly. It does not make sense to have a form for the filters. We want to do that on the fly as the user types. But if we're actually typing in form data, we want to wait until the user says they're ready, then they can submit it. Later on, we'll figure out how to validate it, making sure it conforms to certain things. For example, we might say that your name has to have more than 0 characters. For now though, we are able to at least dump that data to the screen. Once we were done with the data, we could also set the value to clear the form field. So I could set up e.target.elements. We're accessing first name. Then we're accessing the value, but we're actually setting it as opposed to reading it, and we'll just set it equal to an empty string. This would have the effect of printing the first name and then wiping the data. So over here, we can go ahead and submit the form. We see that Jen prints, and then the data ends up getting wiped. So we're going to have a lot of flexibility with how we set up our forms, and they'll become more complex as we learn more. For now, though, it is challenge time. You're going to be required to set up a form for the to-do application. Right now, we have the form fields. They're just not structured underneath a form tag. We have this one right here for entering the to-do text, and we have a button for adding a to-do. We want to wrap these in a form and add a bit of functionality. So let's go ahead and talk about what I want you to do. The first thing we're going to do is delete these two. We're going to build those up from scratch since we'll no longer be targeting them by ID. It doesn't really make sense to keep that in place. And I also want you to add the form at the bottom of the list. So that's going to come below the to-dos list. Now you're going to add that right here over inside of the JavaScript. Let's go ahead and clean things up just a little bit. Down below, we have add to do. We just deleted that. So we're going to remove this event listener. And then we have our add to do text, or excuse me, our new to do text. We're going to delete that as well. The only event listener we're going to keep in place is our search text. We do still want to respond to every single keystroke for that. All right, here are the steps to complete this challenge. Steps 1 and 2 are things we've already done. Right here, the first thing you're going to do is create the form with a single input for the to-do text. We only need a single input because we're not going to ask the user what the completed value is. If they're adding it to their list, we're going to assume it's not completed. Step 2 is to set up a submit handler for this new form and cancel that default action so we can actually respond to the form submission via our JavaScript. What are we trying to do in our JavaScript? Well, this is where you're going to do things that we didn't do previously in this video. You're going to add a new item onto the to-dos array where the completed value is false and the text value is whatever was typed in to that form field. Now, you already know how to add items onto an array, and if you forgot, you can refer back to the array section. Once you've manipulated the to-dos array above, what you're going to do is re-render the application. You already know how to do that as well. We re-render the application every single time that search text changes. Let's go ahead and also add in a step 5 real quick. Clear the input field value. Now notice we're not doing any validation, which means that someone could enter nothing and hit the button and it would add it. That's okay for our demonstration purposes for now. As you test your code, just make sure to always put a value inside of the input. All right, take some time to knock out all of these 5 steps. This is not a race, so if you need to slow down and refer to old code or look things up, that's okay. This is all about getting you into the development workflow. Pause the video, come back, and when you're done, click play. How'd you do? I'm going to start at the start with step 1, creating that form with a single input. Now I wanted you to put this below the to-dos, and since we've created this nice container for the to-dos, all we have to do to put it below it is to put it below the div. So right here, a new form, and I am going to put an ID on this form so I can target it for that submit event. I'll call this one new to-do, for example. Whoops, looks like I had 2 spaces there. That's not going to crash the program, but let's keep things consistent. Next up, our input. So the input is going to have a type. We'll set type equal to text. A placeholder, I'll set that equal to something like something to do. And then finally, our name attribute to make it easy to access this value later. We can pick a name for this one. I'll call this one text. The only other thing we need in the HTML is our submit button. We just have to add a button and give it a text value, add to do. Seems like a good one for here. Now we have our form in place and we can see it is indeed showing up. All we need to do to wrap this up is to move on to steps 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's start with step 2, adding that event listener. If we want to add an event listener to the form, we have to first select it. So document, spelled correctly, of course, .query selector. We're grabbing an individual thing. We're grabbing it by its ID. I called that one new to do. Let me check, at least I believe I did. Yes, I did. And then we're going to go ahead and use the add event listener method. Add event listener. What event are we listening for? With forms, the only one we really will ever use is submit. When the form is submitted, do something. And the function lets us specify what we would like to do. Now this kind of brings us into step 2, part 2, canceling out that default action. So I need to name the E argument because I am going to use it, not just for this, also to get my form field values. Right here, E dot prevent default. That will prevent the default action, that full page refresh, adding the data to the URL, and it will instead allow us to access the data down below. Now, what are we trying to do in here? We are trying to push something new onto the to-dos array. That's going to be a call to to-dos dot push. What are we trying to push on there? Well, that's an array of objects, so we're going to add a new object. We're going to match the same properties, text and completed. The text is going to come from that field. So that is e.target to get the form, .elements to get the form fields. Then we access it by name. I called that one text. Now we have the DOM input. How do we get things off of that input? We use value. The only other property we're going to set up on this object after a comma and enter is completed. I'm going to start completed off at false. We want to provide a good default for that. So now we've pushed the data onto the array, and we are going to re-render the application. We're going to re-render that list by calling render to-dos. Render to-dos, we're going to call it with the updated array and the same filters. This is going to make sure the latest data shows up. And then step 5 is to clear that input value. I can take this code from up above, copy it down below, paste it, but this time setting the value, I'm going to set it equal to right here. Let's go ahead and set it equal to nothing at all to clear the field. So there we have it, steps 1 through 5 all wrapped up. Now, the most important step is to test things and make sure they work. Otherwise, we're just playing a guessing game. I'm going to save the file. The browser is going to refresh, and we're going to go ahead and type some stuff in. This is something new. I'm going to hit enter, and what happens? This is something new shows up as an item in my list of things to do, and the form field gets cleared. If I add another one, something else, we can see that not only does it show up here, it also adjusts the amount I have left. So right now I have 3. If I add another one, I go up to 4. So there we have it. Using form submissions, we're going to be able to modify our application's data and get things re-rendered. We're now responding to user interaction in a really meaningful way. We can still filter the data, so I can type in else just to see those. We have a lot of flexibility, and we're starting to resemble a real-world application as opposed to a little prototype. There is still more to do though, so let's just take a quick second to recap. In this one, we talked about the form. It is a way to encapsulate a bunch of different inputs. In this case, we have a simple form with just one. We can listen to that form submission using the submit event from our JavaScript. And as always, we're going to be canceling that default action, allowing us to run our own code. Now, what the code does is going to be up to the individual form. In the case of the to-do app, we added a new to-do. Later on, we'll be doing something similar with the note-taking application. For now, though, that is it. That's where we're going to stop for this one. I'm really excited to continue on working on these 2 apps, so I will see you in the next one.